A student with type 1 might show up in your office for a number of reasons. I think falling into one of two kind of camps. Some students will show up and tell you right away that they have type 1 and identify that as part of the reason that they're there. And other students will show up with other concerns, and type 1 will very likely play a role somehow, but they may not immediately bring that to you as a concern and something that they want to talk about right off the bat. For those students where it is a concern, I think it's likely to be a concern because they're struggling to manage their diabetes at college. And that could be for any number of reasons, but I think what's most important to know is that you do already have the tools to help them, from your knowledge of psychology and counseling and how to support people. Cognitive behavioral techniques, for example, can be really easily applied to diabetes if you know enough about diabetes to do that. We know so much from behavioral medicine about how to help people set smart goals and meet them and track their progress and improve their adherence. So you have a lot of tools at your disposal to help that student who's struggling to manage their diabetes. And then in the other camp, I think you have students who may be struggling for other reasons. Maybe they're having conflict with a roommate, and part of that is around the roommate is always eating all of their food in the refrigerator. They have a low blood sugar and there's nothing there for them to use. That's one example. I think they may be struggling. We know there's a higher incidence of depression in students with diabetes, and they may be struggling with depression through the transition as many college students do, but then maybe as a result, their diabetes care has also declined, and so that's an added piece or issue for them. So I think it could be a part of another concern that they present with, or it could be the primary concern, the reason they're coming to see you. As a college counselor, when a student with type 1 comes to see you for the first time, ideally you will have known already that they have type 1 and been able to do some research in advance, but you may not have. If in that first session a student feels like they have to educate you about what type 1 is, that can really damage the process of building rapport. It can really sort of set them off to feeling like you're not possibly going to understand, and they're wasting time having to educate you about it, and may even be less likely to come back again. Most students will have an endocrinologist or a team, maybe even including a psychologist or a social worker or a counselor at home, and those people will be very willing to talk to you. If you can get a release of information so you can speak with them and learn what you need to know about that particular student, but just about diabetes in general, that will put you 10 steps ahead, and I think that can be a great way to get the information you need. Diabetes burnout and depression often go together, but not always. So diabetes burnout really refers to a state of mind or a state of being where a person with diabetes has become so overwhelmed by the number of tasks involved in caring for themselves that they stop doing most of those tasks. In all my time working with people with type 1, I have never met the person really who has stopped doing everything entirely, because quite honestly, they wouldn't be there if they did. So diabetes burnout might look like doing just the bare minimum to keep going. So it may be a student who's on injections who's only taking long-acting insulin. A student on a pump who puts the pump on and allows it to give the insulin on its own, but doesn't do anything to give extra insulin when needed. A student who's never checking their blood sugar, or very rarely checking their blood sugar. But they've just gotten so overwhelmed that they don't have the motivation or the energy to continue to take care of themselves. That's burnout. You know, we all as therapists and counselors know what depression is. It's that low depressed mood. It comes maybe with disruptions in sleep and appetite, lack of interest or loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities. All of those things may be present in diabetes burnout to some extent or another, but I think the key difference is understanding how pervasive it is. So if the depressed mood is specific to diabetes, the loss of interest or motivation is only around things related to diabetes care. Disruption in sleep could be that blood sugar is running high all the time and makes them tired, not that they can't get out of bed in the morning because they don't have the will to go to class. So making those kind of fine distinctions between what's driving the symptom or behavior and how pervasive it is, if it's specific to diabetes or if it's really about everything. You know, I'm not hanging out with my friends anymore because I just don't have the energy or the interest. Then we're worrying more about depression. But I think it's important to know that the symptoms of burnout can look a little like depression. Sometimes the two go together, but not always. The overwhelming nature of having to do it all on your own right from the get-go is very different. So the child who was diagnosed with type 1 at age 5 likely did almost nothing themselves when they were first diagnosed, and over time took on more responsibility. That comes with its own challenges. But the student diagnosed in college has a whole lot to absorb all at once in a time when they're already occupied with academics and social relationships and activities and all sorts of other things. So one way, for example, to use SMART goals with a student with type 1 would be to help them to identify one high impact behavior that they could change that would have a big effect on their blood sugar control. And this is a place where you might want to consult with their healthcare team to get an idea of what that behavior might be. But just as an example, if the student is not ever checking their blood sugar before going to bed, then they could potentially be spending anywhere from 6 to 10 hours of sleep with high blood sugar and not knowing it. And if they changed that one behavior and checked their blood sugar before bed and took insulin if they need it, then they will be spending a third of their day in better blood sugar control. But it's only one behavior that they need to change. It's just one example, but I think that working together with the student with what you know about setting goals and tracking progress and consulting with the healthcare team when you can, that's one example of a way that you can use the skills and tools you already have at your disposal to help a student specific to improving their diabetes control. We know that eating disorders are a big concern on college campuses. It is a little different for students with type 1. I think that one helpful thing to understand is that the student with type 1, particularly who has had type 1 for a while, has been counting carbohydrates much of their life. And counting carbohydrates is not so different from counting calories. And we know we discourage young women especially from counting calories. We encourage them to think about eating healthy and eating healthy foods and thinking kind of holistically. But that's not really possible for the young woman with type 1. They have to count their carbohydrates in order to calculate their insulin doses. And so to manage their diabetes, they have to be sort of hyper-focused on what they eat, when they eat, how much they eat, and that can be a pretty slippery slope toward an eating disorder. And it could be a traditional eating disorder in the sense that they restrict their food intake, or it may be bulimia with binging and purging, but you may have heard the term diabulimia, and that's a little different. And that's the fact that it is possible to lose weight by omitting insulin. Because if you don't take enough insulin to cover the food that you eat, then essentially that food doesn't get processed by your body, and you will lose weight. And so it is possible that the student with type 1 doesn't appear to have an eating disorder in the sense that they're eating as much as they ever were, they're not necessarily exercising more, they're not binging and purging, but they're omitting insulin and therefore losing weight. And so that's a different piece to be aware of when you are assessing for eating disorder and treating eating disorder in college students.